Well, hey there, Life Groups. It's great that you're back at her and that we're, as a church, back at her in our study of the book of Acts. This past week, we looked at Acts chapter 8, and we looked at it, first of all, from the context of the previous story. Because in the previous week, which I'm not sure you got a video about, we looked at the life of Stephen, who was a Jesus-like figure in the first century church, but the more Jesus-like he became, the more persecution he experienced. And it kind of cast a vision that a life with faith can be hard sometimes and even difficult at the level of experiencing persecution and hardship. That became the context for the story of Philip that we looked at this week, which was actually the story of Philip's interaction with two different people of quite a stark contrast. There was Simon the sorcerer, and there was the Ethiopian eunuch. One a wannabe, one a VIP, one kind of inspired by everything they saw in all of the spiritual activity, one inspired by what they read in the scriptures and what they began to understand about the person of Jesus. One focused on the externals, one with a sincere internal heart desire to follow Jesus and represent that in baptism, and one whose faith was condemned, and one whose faith ended up becoming contagious and ultimately beginning to convert an entire continent when he brought it back to Africa. And so with the starkness of that contrast, in the context of a legitimate life of following Jesus involving persecution, I think God through Luke gives us today a choice. Do we want to engage in kind of a faulty or a false version of faith that is more about treating Jesus as a means to a different self-oriented end and engaging in faith just for what we can get out of it, versus a purer, simpler, more legitimate devotion to Jesus that follows Jesus simply for Jesus and seeks to know him better, seeks to understand his love in a fuller and greater way, and seeks to become more like him through the transformational process that his Spirit provides? Are we engaged in a life of faith for what we can get out of it, or do we follow Jesus for Jesus? Using a wedding example, are we more interested in the person than the perks? And I provided some practical kind of questions or applications at the end of the message that maybe can become the basis for some of the questions that you talk about as a life group. I encourage us to take an honest assessment. So each of you could maybe consider, how much your faith resonates the heart of Simon the sorcerer versus how much it's trying to track with the sincerity and purity of the Ethiopian eunuch. You could talk with each other if you know each other well enough to speak into each other's blind spots and where, you may find yourself valuing healthy, wealthy, wise, prosperity, gospel kind of perks of faith more than the purity and simplicity of devotion to simply following Jesus. Talk about with each other what spiritual growth means to you. Is it a greater experience of the upsides of spirituality or a greater likeness of Christ? Maybe share your spiritual goals for the year. If you imagine yourself 12 months from now, are you hoping that your faith will generate a greater degree of prosperity? Or are you hoping that your life will resemble more of the sacrificial, others-oriented, privilege relinquishing, standard of living reducing, outward love pouring, self-emptying heart of Jesus? Right? Which is it? And similarly, how do you share the good news with others when you talk with people at your workplace or in your neighborhood or with your family or friends? Do you kind of try to draw them in or explain faith according to the upsides it might provide them? Or do you focus a conversation around the person of Jesus and just how compelling he is to you? And then finally, in the question I asked about why church, consider why you're even part of a faith community. Is it for what the church offers you, for what you can get out of it, or what's here for you or your family? Or is it because following Jesus and pursuing his likeness can be done better together than alone, and you're actually here less for you and more for Jesus? That's a whole bunch of, I hope, stimulating conversation that we can have as groups. I want to wish you all the best as we continue in the story of us, appreciating that these lessons from the first century apply just as relevantly to us today, and we can consider the kind of faith we're engaging in, whether we treat Jesus as the means to the end or the end, and are engaging faith for what we can get out of it, or legitimately following Jesus for Jesus. Blessings in your conversation this week, everybody.